Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources to hopefully help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with this very special guest, not a stranger to the airwaves of WHCR, Mr. Albert Fox Cahn. Mr. Cahn is the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP. He's a fellow at the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at the NYU School of Law, and a member of the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology. Mr. Cahn began STOP in the belief that emerging surveillance technologies pose an unprecedented threat to civil rights and the promise of a free society. Mr. Cahn received his JD cum laude from Harvard Law School and a BA in politics and philosophy from Brandeis University. Welcome back to the show, Albert.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, I think that was our early, probably late winter, early, not even the spring, definitely pre-COVID,
Yes.
last time you were on the show. So, I guess I'd like to begin with your thoughts about surveillance technology in the context of COVID and what some of the trends you see happening today.
Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
Just the, and sadly, all the things that we were scared about at the time, facial recognition, automated license plate readers, all those things are still a concern. But, amid this really unprecedented crisis with COVID-19, we've seen this array of really invasive and potentially, unconstitutional forms of surveillance that, not only concern us as a civil rights group, but because there's a lot of, really just junk science being sold to the public. And we see governments spending a lot of money to deploy these systems in the name of stopping COVID-19 when there's no evidence they actually work.
Mhm. Excuse me, could you get just a little closer to the mic? Your level is just a little bit low. Want to make sure our folks at home can hear you.
Of course. Is this better?
That's better, thanks.
Perfect.
So you were saying that there's a lot of pseudoscience out there now, and kind of masquerading as a fix or somehow and to intercept or mitigate against the crisis. Well, what are some of those pseudosciences that you see? What are some of the things going on?
Well, some of the technologies that we're seeing being sold to the public to fight COVID-19 are going to sound familiar. So facial recognition, the exact same vendors that were selling facial recognition to police departments to track communities of color and build gigantic databases are now selling it as a public health tool. It's claiming that they can use facial recognition to track whether people have come into contact with someone who's infected as part of this broader public health response. And as a reminder, facial recognition has been shown to be far less accurate for communities of color, particularly Black women. We see evidence that it, feeds into this automated bias. And it creates really concerning implications when you start using that sort of technology as part of our public health infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
But then we see new tools like the COVID-19 contact tracing apps that have been rolled out in many states, including recently here in New York. And these apps are part of a broader Silicon Valley effort to try to fix COVID with technology.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a laudable goal. Like if there was any technology out there that I thought would keep my family safe from COVID, I would sign up for it today. Privacy be damned. I wouldn't really be concerned. But what we see is, a lot of these applications that, when they've been tried in other countries, they've really failed and failed spectacularly. But on top of that, we're collecting a huge amount of data and in the process creating yet another tool for mass policing and mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the whole notion of the contact tracing as just as a technology and who controls that and what happens with that database is, I think, got to be concerning.
Yeah, and let me be clear, we support evidence-based measures like traditional manual contact tracing, especially when it's culturally competent, especially when we have investment in existing community organizations and leaders to reach out to their neighbors. This shouldn't be process driven by the state because we don't see the level of trust needed for people to participate. We need to have language access so that every single New Yorker who has come into contact with COVID-19 can take part in this process, can have a full interview in their native language with a disease detective. And these are the measures that have been shown to work. But part of the problem is that rather than actually supporting those, tried and true efforts, we see the governor doubling down on this new invasive technology, which tries to turn our cell phones into a constant monitoring device, trying to track when people come nearby, how long they're close to us for. And the technology just doesn't work. And worst of all, the governor is still fighting privacy protections that we need to make sure that we actually can prevent this contact tracing data from falling into the hands of law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the governor's motivation is? I mean, he's a knowledgeable guy. He knows about technology. Why is he missing this? What's going on?
I mean, I think it falls into this broader techno solutionist mindset, which is just a big idea, a big way of saying that when you have a lot of technology, you always think it's the answer for the problems in front of you. And when you're Apple and Google and you have these platforms that are being used by people around the world, you want to think you can solve the problem. But in reality, they just can't. Where we've seen, use of these sort of contact tracing apps in the past, Israel comes to mind. We've also seen uses of it in Singapore. We oftentimes see, a lot of problems. We see people getting false positives where they're told they are exposed to COVID, but they haven't been. We see false negatives where people are exposed but never get notified. We see a lot of confusion. We see a lot of alarm fatigue. And we just don't see evidence that helps prevent infection. And with the governor's office, this is a governor who likes to be in control. He's a governor who likes to run the show. And so when you have state legislators who come together and pass a bipartisan bill, like the one that they passed this summer that says that COVID-19 contact tracing data will remain private, that it will remain protected, that it will not be accessible to police, it won't be accessible to ICE. If it's not coming from him, he seems to be resistant to signing on the dotted line. And so, we just hope that he will sign that legislation.
So that legislation has not been signed, Albert?
No, it was passed months ago, and we're still waiting for the governor's signature.
Wow. Now, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about technology. I read one of your recent postings, a story that you wrote about telemedicine and telehealth and what's happening with that, particularly in light of the COVID pandemic. And one of the alarming statistics that I read, that there's been a 5,000% increase in the amount of money spent in this technology area. Tell us a little bit about what's going on with that.
Yeah, during COVID-19, it makes complete sense that a lot of people wanted to have medical appointments done remotely. I've done that myself. I think it's the logical response when we see, so many, healthcare facilities being inundated with COVID-19 patients. But the question is, how do you set up that telemedicine appointment to make sure that your health records are being protected? Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was an emergency. It was a state of emergency. And so we saw regulators coming in and waiving a lot of those rules, saying, hey, privacy is important, but let's focus on getting people health care. And they made it easier for doctors to use whatever technology they wanted to reach out to patients. And as an emergency matter, that makes sense. The problem is we've been in this pandemic for more than 7 months now. We've been in this constant state of emergency, and it's not going to end anytime soon. And so what we were pointing out in that article was that we're creating this new normal where we don't have protections for telemedicine to actually make sure that they're privacy protected. And I think this is going to be a theme we see a lot during COVID-19, that measures that make sense in an emergency as a temporary fix for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, start to become permanent. And when they do, a lot of our rights get eroded in the process. And we need to be really watchful of this.
Mhm, mhm. Let me just say to our listeners and viewers, we're speaking with Albert Fox Cahn, who's the executive director and founder of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And you're listening to Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. We're talking about telehealth and some of the privacy issues. And I want you to talk a little bit about some of the economics, because I was kind of stunned reading the story that you wrote recently about the average amount of money that folks are spending on telehealth, or I guess that the insurance companies are spending on telehealth, and how some of the big giant corporations like Amazon are now looking at buying up some of these platforms. Tell us a little bit about the economics of that.
Yeah, this is a huge business. We've seen multi-billion-dollar mergers for some of the telehealth providers, where companies like Amazon, other tech giants are coming in and buying up the telehealth platforms. We saw this before COVID-19, but it's accelerated during the pandemic because
Mhm,
people see that this is really a potential moneymaker.
mhm,
And one concern we always have when we see these sorts of acquisitions in big tech is that we're going to get even more monopolization, right? We've seen this pattern with Facebook, with Apple, with Google, with a lot of the giant tech companies, particularly Amazon, that the way they try to stay ahead, the way they try to continue to grow is that they buy up anyone who's a potential rival, and they buy up any sort of area where they see emerging growth. And that way they don't innovate to stay ahead often, they monopolize to stay ahead.
mhm,
And a real concern is going to be that if we continue to see these telehealth providers get bigger and bigger and bigger, and if they continue to consolidate, if we get fewer of them, then we're going to end up in a position where they really have a stranglehold on the market, and that they can sort of hold our healthcare hostage to get every dollar they can from delivering these services. And that's especially true during a pandemic when so many people are fearful of going to a doctor's office. But it's going to continue to be true going forward as that telemedicine just becomes more of a part of life and just a normal part of healthcare delivery.
mhm,
And so it is huge money. And one thing that we are concerned about is not just having rules to protect our privacy and rules to protect patients' confidentiality, but also making sure that we protect doctors from being in a position where they have to sort of sign on with the only provider in town and pay exorbitant rates just to be able to provide care to their patients.
mhm, mhm. Now, what is PillPack? I was reading in your story about PillPack generating $5,000 in revenue per user, and that was far outpacing a typical Prime Amazon Prime customer, and that being one of the reasons why Amazon was really kind of looking really hard at this market. What is PillPack? Is that a are they a pharmaceutical provider or?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, they're a remote pharmaceutical provider, and it's part of this broader trend we see with a lot of the neighborhood pharmacies being sort of phased out as they can't really keep up, and these sort of larger consolidated pharmacy benefit managers and pharmaceutical delivery firms taking a larger slice of the market. As we do more and more of this, as we get more and more of our healthcare remotely, that ability to remotely deliver medication is part of that same ecosystem and creates a lot of those same concerns about competition.
Hmm, hmm. And of course, one of the issues that's close to my heart that I work at is the issue of the digital divide, and so many folks in our communities, right here in New York City, the public housing community, which is almost 500,000 people. nearly half of those families don't have internet access at home. And huge demands now because of the remote learning requirement of students. And now if we layer on top of that remote healthcare, we're really behind the 8 ball. A lot of families are.
Yeah, it's really, this is something that seemed like a wonky issue maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago. And, making sure that we dealt with the digital divide and ensured broadband access. But, we're seeing every day how indispensable it is to have reliable access to affordable, high-speed internet connectivity. That without that, you simply can't do your job in a lot of companies. Without that, you can't attend school. Without that, you now can't get your medical appointment. And it's appalling to me that the lack of broadband access that we have in NYCHA. This, from my perspective, this is like not depriving people from having access to mass transit or having access to clean water. Without it, you're really just making it so impossible for so many people to go about their daily lives. And I definitely worry that we're going to see more communities of color and more low-income communities, being put at risk of COVID because they don't have the option to learn remotely or don't have the option to work remotely and are taking risks that more affluent New Yorkers can simply buy their way out from.
Yeah, I come at that issue just a little bit differently in that I've been working with my group, Digital Divide Partners, and the Streaming University to help bring free internet access to folks in public housing. Because we think folks, public housing, the average income is at the poverty level, $25,000. Half the population is unemployed. Folks are struggling to pay the rent, pay the medical bills, childcare. There should be some baseline universal service, I believe, available to folks at no cost, particularly when you're talking about things like healthcare and just the ability to receive your public education, which is supposed to be free. And municipal services, you should not have to pay to get access to that stuff, I believe. And that's a battle that, I've been fighting and folks that work with me at Digital Divide Partners have been fighting for, and working with resident associations and public housing to make that happen, because it's becoming ever more critical. And as you point out, it just kind of like blossomed and blew up in everybody's face, those who didn't know about it with COVID. All of a sudden, you got 1 million kids, and maybe half of which are trying to study and go to school remotely. And it's a huge challenge.
And, when we talk about internet access, in New York City, we're talking about infrastructure that we New Yorkers own. This is network access that, the city owns, that franchises out to networks. That, and, at the end of the day, we can choose the terms under which New Yorkers gain access. We've chosen for decades to let, the giant telcos have, near monopolies, charge exorbitant fees, offer, relatively poor service. And, there's really that we can do better. There's nothing that would stop the city council from using that franchise authority to require free fiber to the home for anyone who's under the poverty line, to require improved access, and to also require network neutrality, so we don't see the network providers using their power to sort of choose which businesses, which services can actually offer their products online and which are going to be in the slow lane.
You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, these providers have such huge market power and such huge economic presence that the politicians are having a very hard time pushing back. One of the things that we're doing now, is we're working with local groups to create resident-owned community networks that the community owns, that the community operates. That's an alternative to the big guys. It's been, there's been so much political maneuvering and pushing, trying to get so-called affordable access, trying to get the FCC Universal Service Fund, to fund access. And it's just been a real merry-go-round, really. And nothing substantial has happened. And even, there's some of the providers now have a $10 or a $15 offer, but they make you jump through hoops. You got to sign this, you got to certify that. And so many folks, poor families, just don't have the wherewithal to jump through the hoops to do that. And even some months, that $10 or $15, it may not be there. If you haven't been poor, you don't realize the challenges of paying those bills every month. And when you got more bills than you have funds, something's got to go. And unfortunately, broadband is one of those things that should be at the top of the list, but it's difficult to put it there when you got food, when you got medicine, when you got clothes for your kids. So, it's something that we continue to fight for. And my group is working, as I said, with residents in public housing to try and help them get control of the situation rather than relying on the big carriers, which has been a losing battle so far.
And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that just yesterday, the City Council's Committee on Technology held a hearing on this exact issue and ensuring broadband access for New Yorkers. And additionally, the city recently released an internet master plan that talked about development. And, I think there's a long way to go in this fight, but we do see, the City Council paying more attention to this. And there does seem to be a recognition that they have tremendous authority to actually put down rules of the road on how our networks will be created and operated here in New York.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. I just want to do a quick station break. Again, this is a WHCR 90.3 FM. You're listening to Community and Technology. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with Albert Fox Cahn, who is the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP. And we're talking about some of the issues around privacy and internet access and technology as it relates to the current COVID pandemic crisis. Albert, one of the things I read a story that you wrote, I guess, over the summer, and I had not heard the term before, immunity passports. Can you tell us what that is and elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a really dark and disturbing history with immunity passports, and they've been coming back to light as a result of COVID-19. So, back during American slavery, we saw a practice in the Deep South of having passports that certified when individuals, particularly slaves, had been exposed to yellow fever, which was at the time quite deadly to many. And, when someone survived, they often were immune. And this was seen as something that could make someone, if they were a free individual, more marketable as an employee. And when they were a slave, more valuable on the auction block. It really is a dehumanizing and twisted legacy. And right now, during this really, terrible period, a lot of people have seen immunity passports as a way to help people get back to work more quickly during COVID-19. But there are a lot of problems, and this is why, and I need to stress this from the beginning, the World Health Organization, CDC, almost every reputable medical agency that's addressed it has come out strongly against immunity.
Break it down, just Albert, just simply what is it for folks who may not be familiar with the concept? What is immunity passport?
So an immunity passport would simply be a document that says you have had COVID-19, therefore you're allowed to work, or you're allowed to work in a condition where someone else isn't. Okay. So an example of this might be if you reopen indoor movie theaters, that only people with an immunity passport can work in the movie theater, and only people with an immunity passport could attend the movie. that if you had a restriction on indoor dining, you could imagine people with an immunity passport showing that they had previously had COVID, and that would be a way to either apply for the job or to eat, or for school similarly. So any of the areas of life that we've shut down, there are proposals to reopen them to those who have had COVID-19 in the past and recovered, and say that you can do these things again. And that sounds really alluring. I mean, I know I would want to be able to go back to a more open life if I could. But there are a lot of concerns with this. So first off, it's not clear how much immunity someone has from catching COVID-19 and recovering. There are some documented cases of people being reinfected. Some of those might be a different strain. Some of those, it's unclear if it's the same strain or if people simply had delayed reinfection. So the whole premise of these immunity passports calls into question, because you can have proof that someone previously was infected with COVID, but that's not proof that they're immune, right? And we have President Trump going on the campaign trail, bragging, saying, I'm immune, you're immune, and just ludicrous statements where any reputable doctor who looked at them will say, no, we have absolutely no idea if anyone is immune, for how long, and to what degree. And if we're going to be talking, and you could have a partial immunity. And so when you talk about accelerating reopening for people with immunity passports, that means that a lot of people who maybe had COVID-19 in the past are now going to be in harm's way because they're working in cramped conditions without PPE, are in crowded classrooms because people assume they're immune when they're not. But it also gets even worse because it gives a lot of workers an economic incentive to get infected purposefully, just so they can get that little check mark.
Wow.
Just so they can get that little pass that lets them into the spaces where they're not allowed to go. And I mean, this is something that, we'll probably, if we had this sort of system, we would see it for ideological reasons, given how polarized we are in COVID-19, but we would see it for economic necessity. People who want to provide for their family getting infected on purpose just so then they, quote, don't have to worry about it. And the results will be deadly.
Now, how is Silicon Valley getting involved in this? I saw that you raised that concern.
Yeah, so, in the 19th century, immunity passports were just, a piece of paper, a piece of cardboard. It was really pretty simple. But now we have all of these invasive tracking apps that will try to tell if someone is immune, if someone is, quote, safe to enter a store. And, we see companies like Clear, which some people may have seen at the airport. It's a company that gives you like a fast pass to go around airport security. They've released an app that would track your COVID tests and give you a color-coded barcode on your phone to indicate your immunity status or your or how long it's been since your last negative test. We see a lot of other providers that are working with companies, with schools, with other facilities to try to turn your testing history into this sort of passport. And really, it's just deeply problematic all around. And it's even more invasive than the sort of immunity passports we've seen historically.
It sounds like another way to stratify society and to designate an elite class and an underclass and just to kind of divide us against each other.
It really is just so deeply inequitable, to have a situation where, well, if you have been infected in the past, or if you can prove you're getting tested regularly, that somehow you're given this additional level of access. But, we've seen from, in the case of the White House, you can get tested as being COVID negative, and that's not proof that you're not in the early stages of the disease. Or, you get false negatives. You get people who are infected but aren't actively shedding virus at the moment they're tested. And so you have this entire industry being built up to test and track everyone constantly, and none of it's evidence-based. None of it's actually based off of what the scientists are recommending. It's all just based off of, what big business wants in order to reopen stores, reopen offices, and pretend that we're not in the middle of a mass pandemic.
Hmm. Now, are there any lessons that we can learn from the yellow fever example that apply today? I mean, how do we get through that back then?
I mean, I think it is purely a cautionary tale. I think that, it was a deadly virus for many, many decades. And, if we look at the lessons of that time, I think it's simply a warning not to give people an economic incentive to be infected. Because if we create that perverse incentive, we will only exacerbate the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Especially at a time when so many families are just struggling to hang on, especially with unemployment being cut back, with so many public benefits being cut back, with the budget constantly under attack. At a moment where people are just scraping by, it really is alarming how many would risk their health, risk their family's health, just to have a shot to get back to work.
Mm. And I just saw a headline today about the White House pushing this herd immunity concept. I guess that's
it's just nonsense. I mean, we're so incredibly far from anything approaching herd immunity. I mean, the most recent numbers I've seen are an order of magnitude lower than what we would need for an effective herd immunity throughout the population. And it's just more magical thinking, right? It's more of the same dynamic of those in power faced with impossible choices, pretending they don't have to make them by just giving us alternative facts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. Okay, if we could just kind of change gears just a little bit. I know you've been involved in monitoring police activity and police behavior. What's the latest update in terms of stops, activities, and surveillance of those guys?
Yeah, it's really been an incredible year in that regard. I mean, look, we are in a historic moment when it comes to police accountability and dismantling, the systematic institutions of police brutality. And so, if not for the uprisings and protests we've seen around the country, I don't think we would have seen a fraction of the momentum that we have. But because of that, because of the advocacy effort, because of the amazing coalition of over 100 organizations that came together with us to fight for police reforms, we actually pushed through the first surveillance bill in New York City in a generation. And so this is a law called the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology Act, which I'd been working on for more than 3 years, which people were saying was, this is a long shot, this will never happen, no one will want to take on the NYPD, but we passed it. And with it, we required the NYPD to open up their records to show New Yorkers every single spy tool that's being used to track our communities.
Wow.
Every single one.
Wow.
And to give us a privacy policy for each of them, and to tell us how that information is being shared, how it's being held, how it's being, is it being given to the feds, to ICE, to other agencies, to other departments. And so in just a couple of months, in early January, we're going to see those reports going live. And we're going to get really unprecedented access into understanding how the ecosystem of surveillance works here in New York. And the NYPD fought us tooth and nail. They did a full court press. They had op-eds in all the papers. They had interviews saying the sky was falling, but the council did the right thing, and the mayor relented and signed the bill into law. And so that was really a great step forward towards dismantling surveillance more broadly.
When was that? When did that happen, Albert?
So the bill was passed in June and signed into law in July. And so, that was really a huge milestone in the fight. But, it's just like, that was just a first step. And we also have had, legislation passed banning facial recognition in schools. We've had over the summer, we had the contact tracing bill that I mentioned. That also passed. Unfortunately, those bills are still awaiting the governor's signature, but we're hopeful that if enough people call on Governor Cuomo to sign those bills into law, that they'll both be first in the country efforts to protect New Yorkers from that sort of surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have been suing the NYPD a lot. We filed 3 new lawsuits this year against the police department and 1 lawsuit against the MTA.
Okay, and what are you alleging? What are you trying to make happen?
So in those cases, we're just trying to understand what sort of surveillance systems the NYPD is using against us, and the MTA as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we demanded records about facial recognition. We demanded records on mobile digital forensic tools. These are the devices that can hack into our cell phones or iPads or computers, and to figure out how often those tools are being used and what information they're able to get. And then we filed a really interesting lawsuit just last week over something called sentiment analysis technology. This was over a $4 million program developed in secret by the NYPD to try to map out neighborhood by neighborhood, precinct by precinct, in some cases, down to just like a corner of a neighborhood, what people thought about the police department. And it really is, when you think about it, a heat map showing who approves of the NYPD, who disapproves, is really chilling, right? Because it suddenly gives them tremendous power to say, okay, that's the neighborhood that supports us. We'll respond faster there. That's the neighborhood that doesn't support us. We'll be slower, or we'll retaliate. And when we found out about it, we were stunned, because they're spending millions, and because they hadn't really made any of this public.
It was hidden.
Yeah. And we asked for the records, and they said, well, we've got over 120,000 documents, but we're not going to give you any of them because it's too much. And so we went to court with one of the largest law firms in the city, and right now we're suing them to force them to hand over those documents.
Wow. Well, listening to that rationale, it sounds a lot like that guy in the White House who is, well, I'm going to help those states and those places where I have supporters and voters, but everybody else, I'm going to deny benefits and deny funding. I mean, it's supposed to be a democracy, and these agencies and institutions are supposed to be servicing everyone.
Yeah, and that's really one of the most problematic things at the root of all of these issues, right? It's small d democracy. It's having a city where the police are accountable to the public, and we see people at the federal, state, and local level just constantly pushing back on that. Look at Trump's claims that we're an anarchist jurisdiction, and using that to to threaten to cut off funding for the city. Doing that simply because lots of New Yorkers took to the streets and demanded that our elected officials actually implement safeguards against police abuse and police violence. And it's not just a man who disagrees with those policies, but a man who disagrees with the very notion that the public should be able to tell the police how our communities will be policed.
Okay, this is WHCR 90.3 FM. You're listening to Community and Technology. I'm Stu Reid, here with Albert Fox Cahn, who's the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And we're talking about technology and surveillance and privacy in the COVID environment here in New York City. We've just been talking about policing and all the surveillance tools that they have. And Albert's been telling us about a big legislative victory that we just won here in New York City, where we're going to be finally told some of the things that are happening, and some of the tools and data that's being collected on us should be coming out early next year. Albert, I'm wondering what your take is on the movement to defund the police, so-called, and how it stopped looking at that, and what's your take on it?
Look, we broadly support the calls to defund the NYPD and really try where we can to amplify the grassroots organizations and activists and organizers who've been doing this work for years, calling for broader systemic changes to the ways that New York's communities are surveilled and policed. The NYPD budget, I mean, with capital budget included, is what, more than $10 billion a year?
Yeah.
It's absolutely ludicrous because we've shifted so many different facets of government operations to the police. And in New York, we also think of how many different policing agencies we have. Yes, there's the NYPD, but if you drive down and take a tunnel, from Manhattan to Brooklyn, you're going to see, state troopers. You're going to see the Triborough Police Department. You're going to see the New York Sheriff. You're going to see, it's just growing more and more. The MTA police. We have this huge policing industrial complex that is taking up so much of the budget, swallowing up these responsibilities that police really have no business taking on. Like, I don't know if you see this, but periodically I'll see a police precinct where they'll have this heartwarming video of an officer going and repairing a neighborhood park or repairing a basketball hoop near the precinct. And these are NYPD employees on the job as community relations officials going out to try to give the NYPD good PR by carrying out basic maintenance. So why do we have the money for that, but we don't have the money to actually pay for parks maintenance by the parks department, to pay for upkeep at NYCHA, to pay for all of the other agencies that we systematically underfund? To me, it's ludicrous that we essentially have this broad propaganda effort to try to make the NYPD seem warm and fuzzy by having them do things that other agencies should actually have the resources to carry out.
I couldn't agree with you more. One thing that I hope the city followed through on, a couple of months ago, the mayor said he was going to take some 80 or 90 million dollars from the police budget and apply it to broadband in low-income communities, NYCHA in particular. We're waiting to see what happens with that and if that is actual reality. But that's another instance of money well spent, better spent, I should say, going to solve some real problems. The police budget is crazy. I mean, it's got to be bigger than many military budgets across the world. And you may agree. I certainly agree that policing and armament generally is not the solution to solving crime. I just saw a headline today that talked about big increase in violent crimes and what are we going to do? And of course, the knee-jerk reaction is more police, more armament, and to me, that's not a solution. I don't know what Stop thinks about that.
Oh no, I think that we have to acknowledge the fact that there has been an uptick in crime this year, and that's deeply concerning. But we have decades of evidence that massive police deployments aren't the way to actually solve that, especially when we're in a pandemic where you have people who are under constant stress, who are in a state of economic uncertainty unlike anything in decades in some cases. And so we see an uptick in crime as a result. But that doesn't mean the response is to double down on mass incarceration. It means actually providing social services, economic opportunity, community investment, the actual sort of broader investment in our communities that's needed to weather this storm. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the U.S. has seen both one of the poorest responses in terms of providing a social safety net amongst industrialized nations, and also one of the highest increases in crime. The two are so closely linked.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we're kind of winding down. We got about 5 minutes left. What haven't I asked you about that maybe you want to talk about? What are some of the other pressing concerns that you see going on today from where you sit?
Well, one of the things that I think is really exciting is we're about to see a very progressive slate of state legislators going up to Albany as a result of the primary elections we had over the summer. And so we're going to see a lot of opportunities to not just play catch up with progressive states like California and Massachusetts, but to actually start to show leadership, compared to, states across the country. And a lot of this can take the form of police reforms and police surveillance reforms. And here I'm talking about some of these like really terrifying new forms of surveillance that are only now coming to light. Things like a geofence warrant, which we helped write the first bill in the country to outlaw this, which allow police to ask Google to give them the names of every single person at an address or in a neighborhood or even in an entire town. It means getting rid of keyword warrants. These are where Google says, we will give you the name of every single person who searched for a specific address or a specific search term or a specific political party. And that's something we've seen police using. It means banning police drones. It means banning facial recognition once and for all across New York State, because the technology is bias broken, and when it does work, just absolutely incompatible with a democratic society. And I think that it's going to take a lot of work to get these bills through. I think it's going to take a lot of public effort. I think it's going to take a lot of pressure on the governor specifically to sign them into law when they are passed. But I think that with a concerted push here in New York, we can really fundamentally transform New York from one of the most abusive surveillance states in the country to one of the most privacy protective.
Okay, well, that's exciting. We're certainly going to keep an eye on that. We've been speaking with Albert Fox Cahn from the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. I want to thank you, Albert, for coming back to here to talk to us here at WHCR 90.3 FM. Been very enlightening getting an update on what's going on with STOP and the overall surveillance landscape here in New York City and across the country.
Thank you so much for having me back, and hope to come back in the future.
Absolutely. Love to have you back, and maybe January when that report comes out about police surveillance and kind of break that down for us.
Sounds fantastic.
Okay. Thanks again. This is WHCR 90.3 FM Community and Technology. See you next week. Thanks for tuning in.